21st century discoveries in the physiology of adaptation and dramatic changes in the validation of substance dependence. Summary. The article shows that the current level of physiology does not disclose the biological mechanisms of the organism transition from one range to adapt to a higher with an increase in the regular forces of the stimulus above subextremia. New trend in the physiology of adaptation. Progredient adaptation explains the mechanism of increasing the tolerance of the organism with dependence on psychoactive substances. POS. It is scientifically proved that dependencies of the organism on POS, not the disease, and the states like progredient progressive adaptation. Urgency of the issue. It is known that at the peak of dependence on any psychoactive substance, a person, for example, an opium heroin addict, uses doses which are multiple times, almost 10 times, higher than the lethal dose for an ordinary percent. Fact that the drug user does not die is explained by the increase in the body's tolerance in response to the increase in the dose of POS. Urgent issues of medicine and not only identification of mechanisms for increasing tolerance, but also validation of the physiological process occurring on exposure to increasing doses of a psychoactive substance and the response increase in tolerance of a POS-dependent organism. Purpose and objectives of the study: adaptation reactions of the organism with regular exposure to a sub-extreme stimulus, lack of adaptive reactions of the organism already known in modern physiology to explain the adaptation mechanisms in response to a further increase in the regular stimulus strength above the sub-extreme level in POS-dependent patients. Vegetative nervous system reactions. Pronounced reactions from the vegetative nervous system (VNS) when exposed to a psychoactive substances indicate the vegetotropy of most of these substances. The magnitude of the force of their impact is closest to subextremal, with regular exposure to some kind of irritant under the influence of subextreme stimuli. An activation reaction with the stages of primary and persistent activation occurs, indicating a higher activity of protective systems. The stage of persistent activation is a true active resistance, stable, lasting, in contrast to the training reaction, and in the absence of constant exposure for a long time, up to 6 months, but with dependence on psychoactive substances. The process does not end with a persistent activation reaction. The dose to which adaptation has occurred is habitual, does not give a euphoric effect. To obtain a neurophysiological shift sufficient for euphoria, an increase in the dose is necessary. Increasing the dose of psychoactive substances after an activation reaction is stressful. 1L. K.H. Garkovy and co-authors, 1977, showed that the reactivity of the organism is represented by a number of flaws ranges, and there are no more than 10 of them. 2. In each a weak stimulus causes a training reaction, an average sub-extreme one, an activation reaction, a strong one, stress. 3. LKH. Garkovy et al. Did not explain the mechanisms that provide, with a further increase in the force of influence above the stress one, the transition of the body, bypassing exhaustion and death, from one level of reactivity to a higher one. Mechanisms of adaptation reactivity. According to pathophysiology, without the presence of such adaptive mechanisms that increase resistance, the body must die from exhaustion, from the breakdown of adaptive mechanisms. When the body passes from the first range of adaptation to the second, but when the body is dependent on psychoactive substances, this is not observed. This shows that the current level of physiology does not explain the mechanisms that provide the body with the transition from one range of adaptation reactivity to a higher one. Increase in tolerance. Changes leading to an increase in tolerance, with dependence on pause, can only be adaptive and not pathological, damaging in nature. Otherwise they would not lead to an increase in tolerance, but, on the contrary, would lead to its decrease and the body would die, already during the transition from the first stage of adaptation to the second. Also, according to the dialectical principle of the mutual transition of qualitative changes into quantitative ones, the accumulation of these changes should lead to qualitative and quantitative changes in the system responsible for the adaptation of the organism as a whole, the neuroendocrine system.
I.N. Pyatnitskaya, 1988. It is known that no less important than maintaining homeostasis than biochemical protection are holistic functional responses to the intoxication of physiological systems. Therefore, we can talk about changing the body's response to the drug. Object and methods of research. Features of the reaction of the neuroendocrine system to any external stimulus. The ability of the endocrine system to positive trophic changes. Hypertrophy and hyperproductivity of the endocrine system. Histological and biochemical evidence. Heat tension of the neuroendocrine system and the reaction of persistent activation cannot explain the transition from a low to a higher range of adaptation with an increase in the strength of PA exposure to stress and above stress. After all, the body then must experience stress, exhaustion and death. This can only be explained by the enhanced functioning of the neuroendocrine system, which is possible only with its physiological adaptive hypertrophy, in response to the regular impact of an external factor. It is known that due to trophic irritation in a working organ, the process of assimilation begins to prevail over the process of dissimilation and morphological changes occur in a physiological way. Object and methods of research. 1. An increase in energy reserves leads to an increase in efficiency. 2. In the functioning of the neuroendocrine system, there is an evolutionary mechanism that contributes to the accumulation of reserves. Anticipatory excitation, described in the 30s of the last century by P. K. Anokin. 3. The autonomic, vegetative, nervous system, ANS, responds to any stimulus with a somewhat excessive neurotransmitter release, as if in anticipation of possible future high costs. The ANS, through neurotransmitters, includes auxiliary and tissue adaptation mechanisms, and due to the excess neurotransmitter release, it takes a break for its own recovery, trophic processes. But, despite the recovery, trophic processes, the ANS cannot hypertrophy. The adrenal medulla is a modified sympathetic ganglion. But adaptive, positive, trophic changes, during pauses, allow the sympathetic ANS not to be depleted, to maintain high activity for a long time, a kind of hyperfunctionality. But there is no doubt that the mechanism of anticipatory excitation is also characteristic of the endocrine part of the neuroendocrine system, when the endocrine glands, releasing excessive hormones, also take a break for their own trophic recovery processes, but unlike the ANS, these processes lead them to hypertrophy and hyperproductivity. After all, Hypertrophy is the lot of structures. Histological evidence of physiological hypertrophy of the endocrine system with regular exposure to a medium-strength stimulus is Elia's research on the stress reaction the adrenal glands bloom. Speaking of adrenal hypertrophy, one must keep in mind the cortical layer of the adrenal glands. Back in the 30s, it was found that chronic morphinization causes hypertrophy of the cortical layer of the adrenal glands of rats, which produces adaptation hormones glucocorticoids, hydrocortisone, cortisone and corticosterone, which increase the body's resistance to strong stimuli.
Research results and discussion. Thus, with regular exposure to psychoactive substances, an irritant of subextreme magnitude, when hypermetabolic processes occur in the metabolic boiler, in the endocrine system, due to anticipatory excitation, an accumulation of reserves occurs, leading to its adaptive physiological hypertrophy and hyperproductivity, which leads to an increase in the body's tolerance, therefore, a subsequent, increasing, potentially extreme dose of psychoactive substances. Processes in the endocrine system. Thus, with dependence on PAS, in each range, and the transition to a higher range of adaptation, one should not talk about a reaction dyad, activation and persistent activation, but about a reaction tetrahedron, activation, persistent activation, then stress, with an alarm reaction, and the stage of resistance, but with dependence on psychoactive substances. The hypertrophy of the endocrine system that has come to this point does not allow the final stages of stress, exhaustion. With an increase in the dose of psychoactive substances, and the transition to another range, everything repeats, etc. Such a process, with a regular, gradual increase in the acting dose of PAS, should not be called a state of constant, chronic stress, but should be called a state of regular incomplete stress. Stress, no matter how regular it is, without the final stage of exhaustion, does not lead to pathology. This process, the authors of this scientific work named, progressive adaptation. Thus, adaptive capabilities grow in direct proportion to the increase in dose, and the role of receptors of the body's protective systems is also important, which signal a possible overdose on PAS, the experience of anesthesia. Therefore, all acquired biological changes with dependence on PAS are only adaptive and, as a result, we must talk about adaptive craving, adaptively changed behavior, adaptively changed reactivity to psychoactive substances, or, conversely, about readaptation, deprivation syndrome, and so on. In the final stage of dependence, the depletion of the body's adaptive capabilities due to hypertrophy of the endocrine system, the receptors of protective systems signal a possible overdose of psychoactive substances, which leads to a parallel decrease in the dose of psychoactive substances that a person is able to use. The strength of the effect of psychoactive substances again turns out to be subextreme. No pathology is again observed. Pathology and dependence on psychoactive substances, a concomitant phenomenon. The compensatory tension of the ANS and sufficient production of neurotransmitters or residual neurotransmitter excess explains adrenergic tension and pronounced autonomic disorders during readaptation, alcohol deprivation syndrome. The activity of the sympathetic part of the ANS against the background of the gradual depletion of the parasympathetic department, the adrenergic system is more stable in ontogeny, also explains the qualitative change, as the narcotic addiction lasts, of the effects of sedative-acting PAS, hypnotics, alcohol, opiates, on the body, the transformation of their initial sedative action in the stimulus. With the development of dependence on psychoactive substances due to the mechanism of anticipatory excitation, which contributes to adaptive activity, hyperfunctionality of the sympathetic ANS, physiological hypertrophy and hyperproductivity of the endocrine system, the role of the neuroendocrine system as a whole, as a functional mechanism of protection and adaptation, becomes leading. Conclusions. 1. With regular sub-extreme effects on the body of psychoactive substances, the mechanism of anticipatory excitation allows you to maintain the activity of the sympathetic/autonomic, vegetative, nervous system/ANS, leads to physiological hypertrophy of the adrenal cortex. 2. With regular sub-extreme exposure to a psychoactive substance, adaptive preservation of the activity of the sympathetic ANS and adaptive hypertrophic changes in the endocrine system, adrenal cortex, lead to an increase in body tolerance. 3. Independence on psychoactive substances, due to the adaptive activity of the sympathetic ANS, adaptive hypertrophy and hyperproductivity of the endocrine system, potentially extreme doses have a sub-extreme, non-pathogenic effect on the body. 4. The dependence of the body on psychoactive substances, due to the increase in the body's tolerance and the transformation of the impact of potentially extreme doses into sub-extreme, is an adaptive process. Recommendations. It is necessary to validate the dependence of the organism on psychoactive substances not as a disease, but as a state of progressive adaptation.